Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another one of our virtual fireside chats. I'm Catherine Holt, the CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. And today I am very pleased to be joined by Greg Wilson, who is the Director of Government Relations for BC for the Retail Council of Canada. He is based in Vancouver, and he describes his job as helping government to understand retail and retail to understand government, which is an extremely important function at this particular moment in history. And I have to say that we're very pleased to have Greg because we have worked with him closely on the plastic bag reduction bylaws that municipalities have been passing. Got to know him well. He worked closely with us to help that work for retailers as well as he could. So welcome, Greg.
Well, it's good to be with you and with your members today.
Yes, retail has been an extraordinarily hard hit, one of the sectors extraordinarily hard hit by the COVID shutdown. So I'm going to start by asking you to give us a sense of first the size of the industry, second the impact, but first give us a sense of how big retail is in BC and in Victoria.
So in virtually every community, retail is the largest private sector employer. So in Victoria, it rivals healthcare as an employer.
Wow.
Last year, 26,300 people in the what's called the Victoria Census Metropolitan Area, which is essentially the Capital Regional District, worked in retail. Our estimate is that that's in about 5,500 stores. So that's a lot of employment and a lot of income. And so retail has a very interesting relationship with the economy, in that when people have less income, we have less discretionary purchases. So what's in people's pay has a direct impact on us. And so we're concerned that our employees are making less money. It's hard to get great data on employment, but the latest 3-month moving average for the Victoria area is that employment has dropped from 26,300 in December to about 22,400 now. Now that's a 3-month average. So the problem with the 3-month average is that 3-month average is February, March, and April. And the one thing we know is that February was a lot higher than March and April. So it's probably a bit lower than the 22,400, but that gives you sort of a scale of the loss. And essentially that means that most, fashion retail, a lot of accessories, luxury shops selling luxury goods or goods to tourists will have closed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a lot of businesses had to make their own decision about closing, that they could operate if they were able to operate. But what we were hearing is a lot of them were choosing to close because they were uncertain. They were worried about offending customers. Could you talk a little bit about the mindset that has led stores to make decisions about whether they continue or not continue?
So I think initially first, there wasn't, of course, BC is unique. We didn't have an order to close retail businesses. What happened was instead that people had to make a decision whether to close or not. And they saw that there was sort of a community-wide closure happening. So they closed their businesses out of concern for the welfare of their customers and their employees. And of course, that's had a tremendously bad financial impact on those businesses. So our estimate was at first about 5% of retail businesses overall were open. But today that's probably gone up to about 15 to 20% of retail businesses being open, because a number of people have reopened either because of customer demand or because of the rather severe financial realities of remaining closed. Mm-hmm. And they've adapted their model, and those adaptations have been very useful in working with government on guidance for reopening stores.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about that, but just before we get to that, just talk a little bit more about what you're anticipating looking ahead. So you talked about only 5% being open at one point, now getting up to gradually increasing that percentage. But do you have any estimate on long-term impact on the sector?
So it's not really clear, it's hard to have hard data. A lot of this comes from our conversations across the country with our retailer members. But what our sense is that in the longer term, so here we're talking about 2 years, that probably 20 to 30% realistically of retail stores won't be open, current retail stores. So that means some won't reopen. But, for organizations like luggage stores, as a sector, they're going to be tremendously hurt by the downturn in travel. And I think it's hard to envision that sector having, strong sales at any point in the next 2 years. So there will be more closures, unfortunately, over the next 2 years.
And how does that compare? There must be a kind of normal level of retail stores that turn over, that don't make it, that close for various reasons, retirement, sale, whatever.
That's always greater in the small independent segment. And it's been accelerating in recent years because of things like increasing labor and property costs. And it's more acute in urban areas, so it'll be much more acute in Metro Vancouver, fairly acute in the Capital Regional District, but as a problem, not something that happens in smaller communities like Port Alberni and Courtenay at this point. So there's a lot of turnover. It's estimated to be about 10 to 12%. And there has been a shrinkage in the number of stores. In British Columbia, there is a net reduction by about 10% of stores in the last 10 years. There are 10% fewer.
This is kind of doubling normal turnover, closures, at least doubling, and adding to those problems that businesses are already facing, and those aren't going to go away either.
So the financial impacts are just devastating. Firstly, you have sales that may be zero, but could be through e-commerce 20% of what your normal sales are, but your entire property cost is there. Thankfully, there's not really assistance on the property cost aspect. Frankly, there's a lot of assistance on the wage piece from the federal government. So that's helped keep the employment number drop. 300,000 British Columbians are employed in retail. We have good figures for that for the end of April, and that drop was about 40 to 45,000 employees province-wide. That's pretty good, actually. It's not, obviously we don't want any drop, but it's not as bad as I had, for example, feared, which means that a lot of businesses are keeping those employees on the payroll. Good for the retail economy, tough for those businesses.
And if this is a longer term proposition, how long is that wage subsidy going to be there to help? That's, I think, a big question for a lot of people.
It's recently been extended, but it's not. It's like 3 months.
Right. Yeah. And you said the property costs continue, and we do have hope of a rent subsidy grant program, but uncertain what that's going to look like now. And probably a lot of retailers own their property rather than renting. So
again, that depends on where they are. If they're in a mall, they certainly don't own their property. But the largest mall owners, the largest mall landlords have been pretty good at creating programs for their tenants, where small Main Street retail stores have tended to have many more problems in this regard. That's not universal, because there are just landlords who have been cooperative and others who haven't. That's probably the nature of the world.
Yeah, and we don't even know the details of that program and how to apply for it and how popular it's going to be. So it's a big question mark still, rent and property costs. You said in passing that there are online sales. And, we certainly, and I know a lot of different businesses themselves have been very strong in their messaging, encouraging, first of all, getting their own products online. A lot of them have started their own online sales under these circumstances, certainly encouraging people to support local businesses and buy local through either delivery or online. But how is that helping?
So some people have recovered sort of up to 20 to 30% of their sales that way. Frankly, there's not enough adoption by the community at large. There are still a lot of British Columbians who are purchasing goods through the large international e-tailers. I don't have to give you a list of their names. So that's a bit of a concern that there's not enough patronage of local small businesses through e-commerce. I mean, I'm asked about it a lot. I think, frankly, the message has to be that if people don't want a lot of vacant storefronts in their communities, that they're going to have to learn to patronize those businesses as best they can. At the moment, that's e-commerce or pick up at the door and delivery options, and we have to all encourage that activity.
And you gave me a good example when we were talking in advance of this live interview about even thinking about those small businesses in the context of what you are buying. Like, you're not necessarily, yes, please go out and buy as much as you possibly can justify under these circumstances where everybody's finances are feeling a bit tight, but you don't have to only buy from large grocery stores. There are many food small businesses that sell food, like cheese shops and butchers and greengrocers and things like that are smaller, that you could also support, not just doing your shopping in one location.
So one of the interesting phenomena is that people think that businesses selling food are making a lot of extra money, except for the restaurant segment, obviously. And that's not actually supported by the evidence. What seems to be the case is a lot of particularly smaller pharmacies and small food stores are struggling, and they're in our communities. This is often where we will go to shop on a normal basis. And a lot of them have sort of curbside pickup options. One small business I patronize has put a milk crate out front of their store during their open hours. And if you don't want to go into their store, you'll call them when you get outside and they'll put it out in the milk crate and you'll pick it up from the milk crate. And so there are people doing very innovative projects like this. And I think, frankly, we have, as people who want to have interesting main streets, we have an interest in helping that along.
Yeah, so you're asking customers to be as creative as you are seeing from retailers.
That's right. And I think we're going to see a lot of creativity from retailers. You spoke about e-commerce. There's a very interesting learning from the 2002-2003 SARS crisis in China, that virtually retail-wide, there was a 5-fold increase in e-commerce adoption, which is to say, even small retail businesses averaged a 5-fold increase in e-commerce sales.
Wow.
Imagine if we had that today in small Victoria shops.
Yeah, so you're saying that's a good thing. It was it was an increase, not just to the big guys. It was to everybody. Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what the stats are coming out of this with regard to e-commerce adoption, because I've heard of so many of our small businesses that have either introduced it or upped their game or come up with different online solutions. So hopeful about that. Let's talk a bit about consumer confidence is another, that's the lingo that I'm hearing a lot. So we're talking about people buying from their local stores, being creative in how they support as many stores as possible, keeping our main streets alive, also doing the online thing. But there's an overall objective of increasing the public's comfort level and confidence in actually getting out of their house and doing anything, including shopping, that we're facing.
So this applies not only to the customers, it applies to retail employees. It actually applies to retailers themselves. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 weeks speaking to retailers who are considering opening their stores. And frankly, there are a lot of retail stores about to reopen in the next few weeks in BC. And so I think that every side here has confidence issues. And it's going to be important to retail to create a warm and welcoming environment, and a little bit complicated. We spoke about the plexiglass shields. Any barrier between the customer and the retailer is a bit uncomfortable for retailers who are accustomed to helping their customers pick products in apparel, choose the right size or color. Also in apparel, fit the garment once it's purchased or once that decision's been made. So there are going to be some challenges. We've seen already really innovative solutions in some of this. And some of that's come actually from e-commerce, and some of that's come from the retail heroes who stayed open through the entire shutdown.
I have to admit that I have not been in an apparel store since this started, been in many other stores and tried to support as many local stores as I can. But what is going to happen with fashion and trying things on, for example?
So I not only had to go to a retail store that sells apparel because I wanted to ask them, and I couldn't find a website. I wanted to ask them how they were managing through this. And I've dealt with a whole bunch of them on fitting rooms, change rooms, and what have you. So I think consumers can have a lot of confidence that retailers are also struggling with this and trying to figure this out. But where you have a floor to ceiling change room with a door, it's a relatively easy issue to manage, which is to say a lot of retailers are planning on cleaning the high touch surfaces between use. So what are high touch surfaces? That'll be the door handles, but it can also be hangers. There's a trend at the moment where government regulation is unclear, but retail practice is a bit clearer, where folks are going to quarantine the guidance. There was actually the garments. There's actually a National Post or Financial Post story this morning about it. The garment will be quarantined for perhaps 24 hours after it's been tried on, or returned or what have you. So that
wow.
And that's going to require a little back of house set series of bins or labeling on shelving or something to, this can't come back out until this day, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, my goodness, whole other layers of space.
With watches and jewelry, I heard a new one this morning where they're going to ask their customers to sanitize their hands or wash their hands before trying on watches or jewelry.
Right. Yes, that seems like a manageable approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing that's a factor, though, is, and I was mentioning to you, we talked about this with Jamie Sawchuk from Deloitte, which is watching the trends that are happening in other countries around the world that are trying to reopen, and the fact that even with stores being fully prepared, and government saying it's okay to get out and shop and do what you used to do, that the public is in these habits now, and they're at home more, and they're eating at home more, and they might go to their office, but they're then just coming back home. They're not circulating, they're not window shopping, they're not impulse buying, they're not resuming their normal level of consumption.
So it's interesting. There have been a number of studies, and Deloitte's done an excellent bit of work on this, and I've seen other work as well. So there are different curves. There's a V curve where there's an immediate downturn and a return after the crisis. There's a sort of U curve where demand drops and then it rebounds sort of more gradually. And then there's the L shape where it stays down for quite a while. The L shape probably applies to luggage. I think, that the evidence suggests that for a lot of the fashion and apparel and houseware segments, that it's U-shaped. It'll take some time to recover, but the evidence from East Asia and from Western Europe is that it will recover. It's just, they may not return to the current position for, a period of time that could be a year or 2 years, or the pre-COVID position.
Okay, we have a question from the audience that is related to this. Can you address concerns and legalities around accepting cash payment? And then a second part to that question, which is what happens with exchanges and returns of merchandise?
Well, cash is an interesting one. There is actually no law that says you have to take cash. That said, there is a segment of the population that does not have access to debit cards or credit cards. And I work for an industry that knows that debit fees are significantly lower for merchants than credit card fees. So if you use a debit fee, there's usually a one-time usage fee for, for the purchase or for the tap. For credit cards, there's a percentage called the interchange fee. So not only is a credit card customer perhaps paying fees, but the bank is charging the retailer somewhere around 2%. It's higher for premium cards of the purchase. So we have a preference to cash or debit. Some of our customers don't have access to credit or debit. I think there is going to be a place for cash. The complication right now is cash handling. And the BC Centre for Disease Control and Dr. Henry answer this question routinely to say that good hand washing practices are what's necessary. Some grocery stores have cash only lines. I think that's a good answer for a large retail business, a bit harder for a small retail business, but clearly hand washing and hand sanitizer can be part of that solution.
And what about the exchange and return? So
returns and recycling, the Ministry of Environment reminds me regularly of the importance of encouraging recycling. I think we'll see some changes. So for returns, if the item is being shipped back to the manufacturer or something, I think it'll sit a quarantine period in a back room of a store. Mm-hmm. Before it's handled either and put back out or returned to a customer. For recycling, I think what will happen is people will be putting things in bins that are lined with large plastic bags, a bit contraindicated for in this non-plastic world of ours. And then those bags will be put in a back of store place until they're handled and sent to be recycled at a later point. It's a concern of ours that somewhere there's a backup of recycling material. This has been a problem for large water bottles and others, things in Quebec for reusable, refillable beer bottles. Not as much of the market here has that problem, but you could see that circumstance where and there's a growing demand even for soft plastic as a recycled fiber. So the shortage of recycling is something that we've all got to get our hands around. And frankly, local governments have a big role here to encourage the breadth of recycling centers that are necessary.
Yeah, and I took that question, a good point to expand the answer to just recycled materials in general, and I think businesses that take those things back. But I was assuming that the question was about, say you buy a jacket and you bring it back. So it sounds to me like it's the quarantine that will be important in those circumstances.
Yeah, I know that several large Canadian fashion retailers take back their products at end of life. I assume that most of those will find a practice to continue to take that back, and that produces better environmental outcomes. So the handling is going to be the issue.
Yeah, so the quarantining of returned items and all of these practices that you're talking about reminds me of the other part of our conversation previously, which was trying to make customers comfortable by ensuring them that you are thinking about all of these things. So what are some things that retailers can do? So your language was, don't scare your customers. So what do you think is required of retailers at this point?
So I think retailers have a natural affinity to welcoming customers, and they want to welcome customers and ensure customers have a great in-store experience. And I think that's going to be, I'm actually looking forward to seeing some of the innovative ideas. We have a series of guides on our website. There's actually, the series is going to be 6 about operating a store in the pandemic. They're free to download. One of them is on merchandising and marketing. And in it, I've seen all sorts of innovative solutions. That said, I went to an apparel store and saw different innovative solutions. But, you know, you'll see, we talked a lot about fitting rooms, so I'll try and use other examples where people are trying gadgets, electronic and otherwise. You know, some of the chains are wiping those down between trying them on. I talked about the hand sanitizer use. One place I've heard is when you're fitting a garment, that both the staff member will wear a mask for that brief transaction and the customer to help. You know, you can't keep 2 meters apart necessarily when you're marking some well, either personal garments or marking apparel alterations. And so those things, in those circumstances, you're going to see things like masks. You've seen that with some grocery stores. I think I'll go with Dr. Henry and say I'd like to see some science there, but you know, I think that'll happen. I'm hoping we're going to see a lot more creativity on the masks themselves. I know a lot of retailers are selling cloth masks now, and they look a lot more interesting than these plain little blue or white ones that we're finding, you know, in boxes of sort of the non-medical grade masks.
Yes, the very serious medical mask is.
Well, they're not even necessarily medical grade.
True. Yeah. So we're almost out of time already. But I was just going to say, this is just my personal contribution. I think that businesses are doing a good job, and it's also a tip for businesses that haven't done it yet. When they actually just explicitly say to their customers and post it like a pledge or a list of what they are doing, and I've seen it in lots of businesses. Here is what we are doing to keep you safe, so that people can walk in the door with a sense of confidence and that they know that these are the practices, and it doesn't have to be a lengthy conversation or doubt or uncertainty. You've got this list of what is this business doing to keep you safe. And I think that goes a long way
there's been a lot of great creativity on the look and layout of those signs. And I think, I mean, they've been very interesting and fantastic. I saw one from a small Okanagan retailer that I thought was the most beautiful and most lovely worded. Please don't come in if you're ill. You know, please buy from, if you're afraid to come in, please buy from us at e-commerce. It was a touching and beautiful sign, and I just loved the sign, and I'm looking to a lot of creativity there.
Yeah, and that meets your criteria of retailers know they have to be warm and welcoming to get business and make people feel comfortable and bring them back. So any effort in language to do that helps. Mm-hmm. So I know you've been involved with WorkSafe BC on the guidelines for retail. When can we look forward to seeing those?
Well, they told me Thursday or Friday, but you know, they're trying to get guidance that passes not only WorkSafe's requirements, but the health officers and BC Centre for Disease Control's requirements. That's taking them some time. I can explain why that's complicated quickly. Sometimes the measures we suggest have, like, for example, if you say, well, shorten the hours a store is open, that actually concentrates more customers in a smaller period of time. So there are suggestions that seem logical that are actually contraindicated if you're trying to have good physical distancing. And that's a very tough subject to negotiate.
Good point. So under development, well on the way, but maybe not.
A day, 2 or 3 days. Yeah.
Okay. You're optimistic that
I'm
they're
optimistic.
coming soon.
But a lot of stores have, way more well-developed plans than the WorkSafe plan.
Right, and there's no problem exceeding WorkSafe's requirements. So feel free to do your best, and then you're probably going to be exceeding what they're expecting of you anyway.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, Greg, thank you very much for all that insight and wisdom from the Retail Council of Canada and your personal expertise, and very happy to be joined by you today.